From the studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. It's Friday, July 31st, 2015. How Afghans view the U.S. war with journalist Anand Gopal, and what motivates U.S. empire building with Noam Chomsky on the Henry A. Wallace National Security Forum. And 25 years after the signing of the ADA, we'll speak with author Lennard Davis about his new book, Enabling Acts, the hidden story of how the Americans with Disabilities Act gave the largest U.S. minority its rights. That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Cristina Mislan. She's an assistant professor of journalism studies at the Missouri School of Journalism. Hi, Cristina.
Hello, Sonali.
Jewish Israeli settlers set fire to 2 Palestinian homes in the West Bank this morning, killing a toddler and injuring 4 others. The baby was 18-month-old Ali Saad Dawabshah. The arsonists spray-painted the Star of David on the walls of the burned homes and scrawled the word revenge. According to the Washington Post, the arson assault was quickly labeled a price tag attack in the Israeli media, a phrase used to describe violence and vandalism carried out by settlers and their supporters to extract a price for any actions against them, either by the Israeli government or Palestinians. Both Palestinian and Israeli officials agreed that the attack was an act of terrorism. Jewish settlers in the West Bank have targeted Palestinians and the Israeli government, demanding the building of more settlements. Cristina, I'm just wondering if the roles were reversed. If it had been a Jewish Israeli baby that had been killed by Palestinians, it would have been just the impetus for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to launch a new war against Palestinians, right?
Right, maybe. I mean, at least we know that there would be some sort of violent reaction, definitely. I think we need to get some insight into the roots of such violence. So, for instance, many Palestinians themselves have spoken to the fact that the Israel government has, in fact, enabled and incited violence in the occupied territories. And so it is actually the Israeli government that often terrorizes Palestinians on a daily basis. So we shouldn't be surprised to see that violence is being carried out by some Jewish extremists. But, again, this violence in many ways is rooted in the state. So I think we always have to bring it back to that issue as well.
Here in the United States, environmental activists in Portland, Oregon have ended their 2-day protest against a Shell icebreaker ship called the Fennica. The ship was held up for 2 days after several people blocked it from leaving the port. Some activists hung from a bridge while others were in kayaks on the water attempting to block it. The Fennica is headed to the Arctic to break up ice in the Chukchi Sea that the activists are worried will destroy a fragile natural environment and fuel climate change. The groups involved were from the Portland Area Climate Action Coalition, including 350 PDX, Portland Rising Tide, and the Sustainable Energy and Economy Network, and they were supported by Greenpeace. The ship has now been able to leave the port. Cristina, how important is this type of activism? It's intended to stop drilling in the Arctic. Can it send a strong enough message to Washington, D.C. to not approve permits to drill?
Well, it's definitely important that it sends a message to the public and political figures. But will it stop Washington from approving the drill? I'm not so sure. I mean, I think if that was the case, we would be seeing a lot less drilling now in the United States itself. And so I think this is a topic, obviously, that people have been concerned about for years. I mean, documentaries like Gasland and Crude and many others, there are countless others that have done the same, exposed multinational corporations' exploitation of the earth. Unfortunately, protesting isn't enough, right? But it still is important to continue that conversation. And that's what these activists are definitely doing. And, again, we have to be reminded of the fact that Washington is bought by the corporations, and so it's going to merely act in those interests.
And finally, supporters of Bernie Sanders' presidential candidacy packed into thousands of homes this week at house parties to hear a simulcast of his message. Senator Sanders spoke from a home in Washington, D.C. His remarks were broadcast into 3,500 homes, bars, coffee shops, and more across the nation, at which 100,000 people were estimated to have attended. During his address, he continued to focus on income inequality, saying, quote, "The American people in our great country believe that our government should belong to all of us and not, as is currently the case, to a handful of billionaires." Sanders also mentioned Sandra Bland, the African-American woman who died in police custody in Texas and whose death has angered the public. He said, quote, "People should not die because they did not put a signal on making a right turn." The event broke records for presidential event turnouts. Now, Cristina, whether or not one supports Sanders, the question is, can he break the deadlock of money in American politics through sheer grassroots campaigning like this?
Well, I think it's something that we'll have to see. I know in some ways, I think about President Obama's achieving unprecedented goals when raising money during his presidential campaign, and also getting a lot of young people to become part of the campaign as well. And so I think, people also called his election a grassroots one. But now I think when we look back on it, I think we would say it was actually probably not one. So that might be an area where we can actually learn from President Obama's campaign. But I think we should also remember, let's not get too excited yet. And I say that precisely because of the presidential election of Obama. And so Sanders' campaign might be providing us with this refreshingly new look at politics, especially in comparison to Hillary Clinton. But again, we did say the same thing in 2008. And so maybe the difference here, though, is that Sanders has actually used phrases like institutionalized racism. But remember, white privilege affords him that option.
Good point. Thank you, as always, Cristina, for joining us. We'll talk to you again next week.
Thank you.
Cristina Mislan is an assistant professor of journalism studies at the Missouri School of Journalism and our daily Newsflash guest expert on Fridays. This is Uprising. We'll be right back after this break. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali. Afghanistan's Taliban has chosen a new leader in the wake of the news that their original leader, Mullah Omar, has died. As the war in Afghanistan escalates, even as it was supposed to be wrapping up, we take a look today at how Afghans view the U.S. war. As part of the Henry A. Wallace National Security Forum, journalist Anand Gopal joins me today. He is the author of No Good Men Among the Living, America, the Taliban, and the War Through Afghan Eyes. Gopal served in Afghanistan as a correspondent for the Wall Street Journal and the Christian Science Monitor. He has reported on the Middle East and South Asia for Harper's, The Nation, The New Republic, Foreign Policy, and other publications. When the U.S. invades a country, we often only hear about it through stories about our soldiers and commanders, and not through the eyes of those being occupied. Joining me now is Anand Gopal, one of the very few foreign journalists to have embedded with the Taliban. He's the author of No Good Men Among the Living, which recounts the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan through Afghan eyes. Welcome, Anand.
Thanks for having me.
Well, first, in your book, No Good Men Among the Living, you draw attention to the impact of U.S. policies in Afghanistan all the way back to the Cold War. And I'm wondering if you can trace those policies. How did such policies allow eventually for the emergence of the Taliban?
Well, when the Soviet Union invaded in 1979, resistance was sparked because of this. And the U.S., particularly the CIA, flooded Afghanistan with guns and weapons and created what's called the Mujahideen, or the Islamic holy fighters. And this also created warlordism. So the warlords that we see today in Afghanistan originate back in 1979. There's no warlordism before then in the country. And so these Islamic radicals and these warlords have been fighting ever since, and it's been in that chaos that the Taliban originally arose.
Now, we're supposed to be drawing down the Afghan war, but because of bilateral agreements signed between the US and Afghanistan and President Obama quietly extending the war, it's not clear if, in fact, we are withdrawing. What is the attitude of Afghans, ordinary Afghans, to the US troops and what they see as an occupation that may have no end?
Well, Afghans are divided on this question, and in many ways it reflects the fact that the country itself is divided into two parts. The war is only being fought in about half of the country, in the south and in the east. And the other half of the country is mostly at peace. So if you talk to Afghans there, in the areas that are at peace, many of them will say, you know what, we'd rather the troops stay in Afghanistan as a buffer against future civil war or the rise of the Taliban into their areas. But if you talk to Afghans in the areas where the war is being fought, most of them will tell you that they're tired of the fighting and they don't want troops there because they see troops as part of the reason why there is so much violence.
So the US has spent over $1 trillion on the war in Afghanistan. In your view, what has all that money accomplished?
If you go to Afghanistan, if you travel through the countryside, one of the most shocking things is just how underdeveloped the country is and remains, despite the fact that the US has actually spent more money in Afghanistan than it did in the entire Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe after World War II. That's just a staggering amount of money, and most of that money has not reached ordinary Afghans. It's gone into the coffers of major corporations, it's gone into the hands of warlords, strongmen, private security companies. A lot of it has gone to Dubai, but roads are still in a state of disrepair. There are schools that are abandoned. People don't have electricity. The level of infrastructure in this country is one of the worst in the world, and that's staggering considering the fact that we've probably spent more money in Afghanistan than we have in any other country in the world.
So over the years that you have been reporting from Afghanistan, what sort of changes have you seen in the day-to-day lives of ordinary people, particularly marginalized populations like women and children?
In 2001, Afghanistan had already been at war for about 2 decades. There were no jobs, there was a massive refugee crisis, and there was a sense that maybe with the United States coming, a lot of these things would change. But instead, what you've seen is more of the same, another decade of war. And so the hope that was there in the early years is gone, and it's been replaced by cynicism. And many of the Afghans that I speak to who had returned to the country from Pakistan or Iran, where they were refugees, and tried to build a life, now they're looking to leave again because from their point of view, there is no end in sight. Not only is there the Taliban and US forces, there are also warlords, there are also a host of militias that the US is supporting, hundreds of thousands of people with guns who are fighting on one side or the other, and civilians are the ones who are caught in between these two.
So what do you expect for Afghanistan's future, with or without US troops? How are ordinary Afghans going to deal with these warlords that are in power in the government, forces like the Taliban as an unofficial army on the ground? Do you foresee that Afghanistan may be a country where you could see the rise of new militant organizations like we've seen in Iraq?
There are already new militant organizations that are arising. There are splinter groups coming out of the Taliban who are more radical than anything we've seen in the Taliban. I mean, they're small right now, but it's certainly a growing phenomenon, and that's born out of the fact that there's been no end in sight to the fighting. On the one hand, on the Afghan government side, you have private security contractors, the Afghan army, the Afghan police, and warlords, and if you add it all up, that's almost 350,000 men under arms who are being paid for by the United States to fight on the US's behalf. So in other words, a massive proxy army. On the other hand, you have tens of thousands of Taliban fighters, many of them who are farmers by day and pick up the gun by night, and they're supported by Pakistan. Their leadership has safe haven in Pakistan, and you can consider them also a proxy army of Pakistan. So you have what's essentially a proxy war. It's in that milieu that you see some of the even more radical tendencies coming out.
So would you say that the US's policies in Afghanistan have had a ripple effect with unintended consequences as far away as northern Iraq and Syria, with groups like ISIS coming about, and within Afghanistan as well, that US policy has really directly fueled the rise of these movements?
If you look back over the last 30 years, it's certainly the case that U.S. policy in Afghanistan and its counterterrorism policy in general has fanned the flames of insurgency and jihad. Many of the leaders of al-Qaeda got their sort of start in Afghanistan in the 1980s. Afghanistan at that time was a magnet for jihadis, and it was so in part because there was so much money and guns floating around because of the CIA's patronage of the Mujahideen. And that was the start of it. And if you look at Iraq, groups like ISIS only exist because of the chaos that was sown by the US invasion in 2003 and the subsequent civil war. None of these groups would have come about if it weren't for that. And so US policy in Afghanistan and elsewhere around the world is actually continuing to create the very enemies that it purports to fight.
So you just returned, I understand, from northern Iraq and Syria. And what are people on the ground in those countries saying about ISIS? What sort of support is there or lack of? And what sort of attitudes do you see, for example, among the Iraqi National Army and Syrian rebel groups?
Well, in Iraq, I got a chance to speak to people from all sections of society. And one thing that I found is that while ISIS is extremely unpopular, and understandably so given how brutal they are, I did not meet a single Sunni Iraqi who did not view ISIS as equally bad to the Iraqi government. In fact, all the Sunni Iraqis I met viewed ISIS as a lesser of two evils to the Iraqi government and to the Shia militias, who are doing really the same things that ISIS is doing. The Shia militias, whom the US is backing and Iran is also backing, they're beheading people, they're torturing people. You can actually go on YouTube and see some of their videos. In the West, we don't tend to focus on the Shia militias because they tend to be our guys. We tend to focus on ISIS, but from the point of view of people, let's say in Anbar province, they actually view ISIS as a lesser of two evils to the Shia militias, and that's really a tragedy if things have gotten so bad that a group like ISIS can be seen as a lesser of two evils.
Anand, how can Americans see the wars that we allow in our names through the eyes of ordinary Afghans, Iraqis, the people who are on the other ends of our policies?
Well, I think to start with, we need more reporting on the lives of Afghans and Iraqis and others. You know, there's a lot in the news about Afghans and Iraqis, but they tend to be nameless and faceless. They tend to be the object of our attention, but we need to make them the subject of our reporting. You know, we need to actually talk to Iraqis and Afghans and get their experiences, because the world looks very different when you talk to them. The occupations and the wars look very different. And you know, in my travels through southern Afghanistan, I had my worldview change in many respects by talking to Afghans and who gave me a very different perspective on what the fighting was about. And I would have never gotten that if I didn't have a chance to talk to them. So I think we need to make them a center of our reporting.
Well, Anand, thank you for all the work you do and for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Anand Gopal is the author of No Good Men Among the Living, America, the Taliban, and the War Through Afghan Eyes. We turn next to Professor Noam Chomsky, the legendary political analyst, Professor Emeritus of Linguistics and Philosophy at MIT, author of over 100 books. His books include At War with Asia, Toward a New Cold War, Fateful Triangle, the U.S., Israel, and the Palestinians, Necessary Illusions, Hegemony or Survival, Deterring Democracy, Failed States, the Abuse of Power, and the Assault on Democracy, as well as the one he's best known for, Manufacturing Consent, the Political Economy of the Mass Media. Chomsky's latest book is called Because We Say So. Many Americans are not accustomed to the idea that our country sits at the top of a global empire. But with military bases in dozens of countries, interventions in other countries' political processes, and all-out invasions, there's no other word to describe our trajectory. But why are we so prone to empire building? Joining me to answer that question is renowned author, linguist, and political commentator, Professor Noam Chomsky. Welcome to the program.
Glad to be with you.
Where do you think the U.S.'s aspirations for empire come from? Is it the nature of any state to pursue military domination, or do you think there's something specific to U.S. history that this country is particularly prone to imperialism because of?
A good explanation of it was given by John Lewis Gaddis. Expansion is the path to security. If you want to be secure, you have to control everything else. The commitment to empire goes back to the original colonization. By the Second World War, the United States was in a position of unprecedented power. At the end of the Second World War, the U.S. literally had half the world's wealth. The tacit assumption was, we own the world. You can see this very clearly in what happened as soon as this system of power began to erode, and that happened very quickly. In 1949, China became independent. There's a name for that in American political history. It's called the loss of China. The phrase loss of China expresses the tacit assumption that basically we own China, and if it moves to independence, we've lost it. And since we own most of the world in this sense, we have to defend it, so we have to have 1,000 military bases, military forces almost as great as the rest of the world combined, and it runs right through American history. This fear of everything is pervasive. It goes back to the origins of the society. It's related to the imperial thrust of, as Gaddis put it, attaining security through expansion, and that's limitless, essentially. So that's the imperial thrust. It's not unique to the United States. It's developed in an extreme form here, but that's because of extraordinary U.S. Wealth and power.
How intertwined is corporatism and the drive for profit with our militarism? Is it always the case that the drive for access to resources tends to drive our militarism?
Well, if you take a look through history again, in the 19th century, the major commodity, the equivalent of oil today, was cotton. That was the source of the Industrial Revolution. Jacksonian presidents of the mid-19th century explained very clearly that they wanted to conquer Texas and a large part of Mexico, approximately half, in order to try to gain a monopoly over cotton. President Polk said that that would bring England to our feet by gaining a monopoly of the major commodity in the world, cotton. Move on a few years, oil becomes the major commodity. And incidentally, it's not a matter of primarily of access to oil. During the whole period when the U.S. was the major producer and didn't need access to the oil, its policies were the same. The issue was control over oil, not access. And there was a reason for that. When the U.S. invaded Iraq in 2003, Zbigniew Brzezinski said if it works, it'll be very good because controlling Iraqi oil and increasing our control over Middle East oil will give us what he called critical leverage over Europe and other industrial powers. We'll be in a position to hold the spigot. I've just talked about two of the major commodities. You look at others and you get pretty much the same story.
Now, you've written a lot about mass media and how it is often used to manufacture consent from the U.S. public for things like war and strengthening U.S. empire. But today we have a significantly changed media landscape, at least it seems so. And I'm wondering if you feel that we as citizens are still prone to the kind of brainwashing that we once were.
People are deluged with a single message. We're defending ourselves. So take a look at the invasion of Iraq, let's say. Barack Obama is considered a critic, but notice his grounds. Not that aggression is wrong, not that destruction of a society by violence is wrong. It's that it was a blunder. So that implies that if the aggression and violence had succeeded, expanding our control over one of the major resources of the contemporary world, giving us critical leverage over our rivals, then it wouldn't have been stupid, would have been fine. That's called criticism. The worst criticism that can be made within the mainstream of U.S. policy is it was a mistake. These are the standard views of what are called statesmen. people who are committed to defending and expanding powerful interests, powerful dominant domestic interests. And that leads to the thrust for empire and the justification of that thrust as defensive. Now, going back to the population, it is submerged in doctrinal pronouncements of this kind. When enemies do it, we call it propaganda. When we do it, we call it education. But it's not very different. But an isolated individual faced with this deluge of propaganda, of doctrinal uniformity, does have a difficult time extricating himself or herself from it.
Finally, Professor Chomsky, many have predicted that the U.S. empire may be waning, that we're in this sort of twilight of empire phase. Do you have any sense that that might actually be true?
There has certainly been decline from the high point of power, which was 1945. But as I mentioned, that decline began right away. In late 1949, a large part of the empire was lost. There was immediate concern that Southeast Asia might be lost. That's the origins of the Vietnam War. It's concerns over Latin America, the Middle East. In the last decade, South America has gained substantial independence. By now, they're very free from U.S. domination. It's an enormous change. That's the loss of South America, if you like it. So sure, the process of decline goes on, continues, waxes and wanes. It's not a steady process, but there is a tendency for power to become more diffused. But the United States is still overwhelming in many dimensions, crucially in the dimension of violence. The U.S. is far ahead of anyone else in military bases, military technology, far more advanced than anywhere, and even simple military spending. As I said, it's almost as much as the rest of the world combined. So empire is a complex affair. Yes, there's a decline, began in the 1940s, it's continuing, but has by no means abated.
Professor Chomsky, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And Noam Chomsky is, of course, the legendary political analyst, professor emeritus of linguistics and philosophy at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He's written over 100 books. They include At War with Asia, Toward a New Cold War, Fateful Triangle, the U.S., Israel, and the Palestinians, Necessary Illusions, Hegemony or Survival, Deterring Democracy, Failed States, the Abuse of Power and the Assault on Democracy, and what he's best known for, Manufacturing Consent, the Political Economy of the Mass Media, which he co-wrote with Edward Herman. His latest book is called Because We Say So. And earlier you heard from Anand Gopal, who is the author of No Good Men Among the Living. These two and other interviews that I hosted are part of the Henry A. Wallace National Security Forum, produced by Brave New Films. Henry A. Wallace was the 33rd Vice President of the United States. He served under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and he actually ran for president on the Progressive Party ticket in 1948. This is Uprising. We'll be right back after this break. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. July 26, 2015 marked the 25th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act, a landmark piece of legislation signed by President George H.W. Bush. The bill, sponsored by Senator Tom Harkin, was the most important piece of legislation impacting 1/5 of the population, who are people with disabilities. Disabled people form the nation's largest minority, and before the ADA became law, the notion that disabled people had civil rights was not universally accepted. Although today we take elevators and ramps for granted, it was a mere 25 years ago that the many aspects of accessibility and equal rights for disabled Americans was enshrined. Joining me today is Lennard Davis. He is the author of the new book, Enabling Acts, The Hidden Story of How the Americans with Disabilities Act gave the largest U.S. minority its rights. Welcome to Uprising, Lennard.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Thanks so much for joining us. Well, I was very moved by the experience that you relate in the very opening of your book about your parents. Both your parents were deaf, and before the ADA, their lives were extremely isolating. Can you share a little bit of what personally motivated you to write this book?
Yeah, I mean, I was approached by Beacon Press to write the book to come out on the 25th anniversary of the Act. But personally, as a child growing up in a poor deaf family and an immigrant family, I was very aware of the injustices that were done to my parents. And I didn't put it in the book, but as a child, when we would ride on the subway in New York, I would stare at all of the people who were staring at my parents because they were using sign language. I would go from one end of the car to the other and stare them down, and then begin all over again, because I felt that my parents didn't really have their full civil rights. Life was difficult for them, and the only place that they were truly comfortable and accepted was within the deaf community.
So they didn't have access to so many things. We take sign language interpretation today at public events for granted. This is now something that's really important. How isolating was their life? And of course, by extension, that experience I think was typical for persons with disabilities before the ADA, right?
Right. For example, the simplest things that would be available even now to deaf people. But for example, if someone wanted to visit my parents, they would have to send my parents a postcard. My parents, we didn't have a telephone, obviously, no TTY or any means of communication. My parents had to send the postcard back saying, yes, we'll be at home at that point. The person would come to our house, often a deaf person. They'd ring the bell downstairs, and maybe 50% of the time, the jerry-rigged lighting thing that we had to turn a light on so that my parents would know that someone was downstairs and could let them in didn't work. So it's very possible that that person would just simply end up going home and my parents wouldn't have their guests. But that's only one thing. I mean, they weren't able to attend religious services. They couldn't, if they went to the hospital, if they went to the doctor, if they went to the court, there was no way for themselves to make their wishes known, except maybe tediously writing everything down on scraps of paper. It was a world. If they watched television, for example, I was the closed captioner. I was the one who had to tell them what the story was, because they couldn't. All they could do was see the images on the screen. So it was a very it was a world that was shut off to people like my parents who were profoundly deaf.
And also education opportunities, employment opportunities were severely restricted. And this, of course, has a direct impact on the ability of people to have a livelihood, which probably, of course, directly fed right into enormous poverty levels among people who have disabilities.
Well, it's true that people with disabilities are the largest minority in the United States. Even today, they are the poorest minority. When my parents were being brought up, they were sent to, my father and mother were from England, and they went to the London Asylum for the Jewish Deaf and Dumb, I think it was called.
Wow.
And they got a 6th grade education. They learned trades. So my father and mother both were tailors, essentially. But other trades could be shoemaker, working in a print shop on linotype. But there was very little opportunity for deaf people to move above the trades. And they were assigned. Basically, they were thought of as being low-paid factory workers.
So let's talk about what led up to the ADA. The book that you wrote, Enabling Acts, tells a history that that in great detail about what went on behind the scenes in the halls of Congress, in the White House, the kind of deal making that took place and wrangling that took place. Let's talk about the major players in Congress who crafted the bill and worked hard for years to pass facet and also were personally impacted by how poorly people with disabilities were treated. Can you tell us, for example, what motivated Senators Ted Kennedy and Tom Harkin to push for this bill?
Sure. Senator Kennedy had quite a bit of disability in his life. His sister Rosemary was born cognitively disabled, and she became even more cognitively disabled when Joe Kennedy, Ted Kennedy's father, decided to give her a lobotomy when she was a teenager, which really lowered her intelligence and her skills, motor skills, and so on. And she became virtually helpless and had to be institutionalized. Kennedy was aware of that very much so, and he was also aware of his son, clearly Patrick, who had his leg amputated from childhood cancer. Tom Harkin grew up in the Midwest on a poor farm with his older brother was deaf, and his older brother Frank was deaf, and Tom learned sign language and really understood the difficulties around his brother's life. I mean, actually, it was interesting because it also related to this issue about trades. He was being trained to be a baker, and he hated being a baker. And he was able to actually get a better job through some of his cunning that I describe in the book, Enabling Acts.
So the Americans with Disabilities Act was signed into law in 1990, but it was in 1965 that the Civil Rights Act was passed and signed. And the ADA was meant to enshrine civil rights for people with disabilities. Why wasn't the Civil Rights Act simply expanded to include persons with disabilities?
Well, that's an interesting story. You know, the original act actually didn't deal with gender either, and gender was included fairly soon after, but Hubert Humphrey, who had a Down syndrome grandson, decided that he was going to tack on an amendment to make the Civil Rights Bill apply to people with disabilities. And there was a very big pushback, actually, ironically, or maybe not so ironically, from the African-American community. They didn't want disability to be included. They felt that that would be kind of perverting the intention of the act, and also and legitimately, I think they didn't want the bill brought up before the Senate and the House of Representatives because they felt it could have more damaging amendments added to it. So that early attempt failed, and that's why it took another 20, 25 years before we got the ADA.
Now, what were the kinds of what were the kinds of coalitions that were formed on the ground, the kinds of grassroots activism that took place in the lead up to the passage of the ADA? I know that you write in your book there was actually a lot of the lobbyists and people who were doing activism inside and outside the halls of Congress, but that led to the ADA more directly. But for a minute, let's focus on some of the grassroots agitation. Of course, to organize at a time before the ADA must have been a huge challenge for persons with disabilities. As you mentioned, it was hard for your parents who were deaf to even make arrangements to meet other people, for those in wheelchairs without ramps. How did people overcome the challenges of organizing to organize for a bill that would make it easy to assemble and enjoy full lives?
That's such a good question, and we tend to forget now in the internet age how difficult it was to organize. I mean, obviously there were telephone calls. Deaf people couldn't use those, but there were teletypewriters, cumbersome devices that could use the telephone lines. There was a lot of faxing. Everyone I talked to, especially describing the lead up to 1990, just said that they were faxing constantly. That's almost seems antiquated to us now. But the interesting issue really is, like, I think around I think we could say the 1960s, there wasn't really a sense that disability was an identity group and that they were a group that should or would have civil rights. I mean, there might be the blind person there and the deaf person here and the person in a wheelchair there, but they didn't necessarily have or see themselves as having anything in common. There were large organizations that dealt with specific disabilities. There's the National Association of the Deaf, there was the Association of the Blind, there was the Muscular Dystrophy Association, and so on. And each of those were lobbying for benefits for for the people in that group, but they didn't necessarily form a coalition. And the coalitions that came about politically really came about as a result of the aftermath of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. Because in that act, there was a very small, unknown almost, a kind of surprise section that was slipped in, and that really, if you look at the legislative history, was never discussed. No one even noticed it. It was only, it's a tweet length quote. And basically what it said was that any person who is otherwise qualified could not be deprived of their civil rights. So that little section 504 became the basis for the idea that people with disabilities have civil rights.
And this was signed into law by
however,
Nixon, the Rehabilitation Act.
That's right.
Yeah.
It was. Although one of the crucial things that we must not forget is that the act was really supposed to deal with the returning Vietnam vets and other people with disabilities. Mm-hmm. But there is a provision in the act that said, which is a very important idea for people with disabilities, that there should be funding for independent living. And the whole independent living movement was sort of like the SDS of disability rights. And independent living basically means, living in your home, not in an institution, and having funds for things that you need to live independently, maybe personal assistance, maybe an animal who helps you, maybe wheelchair technology that will help you. So that money was in the bill, and Nixon vetoed the bill twice because he didn't want that money in there. And the third time Congress took the money out, and then he signed it. So it was kind of a win and kind of a loss.
Right. So yet the part that remained, Section 504, that you identified as this 46 words that changed history in your book, how did that then become the basis for the movement leading to the ADA? These words were in the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. It wasn't until 1990 that the ADA was passed. Did activists seize upon Section 504 to push for a broader set of rights?
Yeah, and I think what happened was word got out that there was this Section 504 and that regulations were being written. And one thing I didn't quite realize is you can write a law, but it doesn't take effect until there are regulations. The regulations were being written, and they're actually very long and complicated, and it took practically 7 years between the law and the regulations being signed. So as word got out, that's when you got the beginning of these different groups recognizing that they had something in common now, which was to promote the regulations of 504 and get that working. So Nixon, as you know, left office, and Carter came in, eventually won the election. And everyone assumed that now, since Carter was a Democrat, the regulations would just, fire through. But they didn't. And Secretary of HEW, Califano, seemed to be sitting on them. So there were nationwide, so this is where the organization really started. There were nationwide demonstrations in every city, in the major city in the United States. There was an occupation of the federal building, the HEW. But the one that everybody remembers was the San Francisco HEW building, which was occupied, I think, for 28 or 29 days. It was the longest occupation of a federal building in U.S. history. And they basically said, we're not leaving until those regulations are signed. And Califano then signed the regulations. But it was in that lead up to that and in the energy around those demonstrations that there began to be a pan-disability movement.
And so how challenging was it to then craft the ADA itself, this law, which ends up being a complex law? And I'm guessing it, of course, had to be complex because disabilities are extremely diverse. The needs of somebody in a wheelchair are quite different from the needs of somebody who is blind or has Down syndrome. How did legislators and lawmakers like Tom Harkin and Ted Kennedy and others involved, and of course their staff and lobbyists, how did they include everybody's needs? Where were the lines drawn?
Well, that's a good question, and I think people don't realize. It's easy to say, "Oh, Americans with Disabilities Act," but this is probably one of the largest, most wide-ranging, most moving parts act passed in the 20th century. I mean, it does make the 1964 Civil Rights Act look like a much simpler act, because, as you said, there are so many things that have to be covered: transportation, communication, employment, public accommodations. It covers, almost everything that a civilian, a citizen in the United States would do. That would be part of their civil rights. So first of all, as you say, the bill had to be crafted. There was this small group that had been set up by Reagan, actually, which was called the National Council on Disability, and it was a group that was answerable. It was formed and answerable to the president. And that group, Reagan picked a whole bunch of people that he knew who were Republicans and who had some relation to disability. And it was ironically out of this kind of very heavily Republican group that the first draft of the ADA legislation came. And it was a rather radical piece of legislation, more radical than the current ADA. And people refer to it as the flat earth or the flatten the earth bill, because it said essentially, like, all this stuff has to happen right away, and we have to remove every barrier immediately. So the world would essentially be flat for people with disabilities, particularly wheelchair users, is the metaphor. Mm-hmm. But that bill had no chance of passing. But it was a good talking point. And so when the bill came to actually come before Congress, go to committee and come before Congress, it had been rewritten numbers of times by many different people. And there was much, as you said, wrangling, arm twisting. I mean, in the book I describe in detail, in Enabling Acts, I describe in detail all of the politics of it, which is kind of fascinating, which is fascinating in and of itself. But the legislation, one way to think about it, and this kind of rings a bell for me when I do think about it, because it's an interesting question politically. Why would conservative Republicans back a bill that looks like it looks anti-business, it looks like it's going to cost a lot of money, it's going to create a lot of
government
regulations.
overreach, etc.
Yeah, exactly. Big. Why would, and interestingly, if you want to talk about bipartisanship, I mean, this was a bipartisan bill, and a lot of conservative Republicans, including Orrin Hatch, who's still in the Senate, were for it. So, in other words, you could see the negotiations on one side as, that the left is trying to protect people with disabilities as workers, as citizens. The right is trying to protect business from being sued under a law like the ADA. So there's this kind of interesting set of negotiations that happen in trade-offs.
And I'm sure there must have been quite a bit of discussion over the costs to businesses to retrofit their establishments that would put them out of business, to install ramps, etc. And how did those get negotiated and navigated? And I think the current ADA, as it is law, does, of course, carve out certain exceptions that were probably hard fought.
Yeah, I mean, actually, one interesting carve-out is that no religious organizations are required to follow the ADA.
Wow, really?
That was a very effective lobbying directly to the White House on the part of many religions. There are complex issues about church and state also that fall into that, but they are carved out. But in terms of businesses, yeah, so there was one of the big fears on the right was that there'd be a Holocaust, I can't use that word anymore anyway, there'd be a conflagration of lawsuits, and that it would be very costly. There are other groups that fought back. One group was the universities, who obviously still are fighting back in the sense that they would have to do so much retrofitting. The transportation industry was screaming. I mean, the Greyhound, the guy who was the head of Greyhound, was in every possible meeting arguing that it would be the end of long-haul buses. And municipalities fought very hard. The idea that they would have to put a wheelchair lift on every bus seemed to them impossible. And what's interesting now when we look back is that it's a completely normal part of our landscape now. But in those days, it just seemed like it was going to be impossible. So what were the compromises? There was a huge trade-off that was done in secret meetings, which I discovered. No one else has covered this. And the trade-off was that the left gave up the punishments that would come from lawsuits. They gave up a range of punishments. And the right gave up restricting public accommodations. So like way more public accommodations are included in the ADA than they were in the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So that's interesting. That was one trade-off. The other is including two small words, double words. One is undue hardship or undue burden, and the other is reasonable accommodation. So the concept there was a business doesn't have to retrofit, it doesn't have to do an accommodation if it would place an undue burden on the business. And by the way, the Flatten the Earth bill, the only reason, what their provision was, that the only way a business could not retrofit was if they were going bankrupt, if it caused bankruptcy.
And that was a more radical original version.
Yeah, yeah. So this version was undue
which, of
burden,
course, is a
vague
term where there's a lot of wiggle room for businesses.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. But on the other hand, it's true. I mean, if you're if you own a grocery store and it's going to cost you a lot of money to do something, you should have some kind of fallback position. The other is reasonable accommodation. So if the accommodation is reasonable, you'll do it. If it seems unreasonable, well, of course, these are words that just sent the results of the ADA into court for a lot of cases, because these are all wiggle terms that need a judge to decide.
Mm-hmm. Now, Lennard, how important was even just the symbolism of the ADA passing, in addition to, of course, it dramatically improving in practical terms the quality of life of persons with disabilities, the fact that, and the concept that persons with disabilities had civil rights that they were born with, and they had the right to. What sort of a cultural sea change did the ADA have on that front?
That is enormous. I mean, when we look back on it 25 years later, the thing that jumps out is the idea that, because if you had said to somebody in 1970, people with disabilities have civil rights, they would have said, no, they have rights to be rehabilitated. They have rights to have a prosthesis, but no, they don't have civil rights. Why would they have civil rights? So just the acceptance of the idea that people with disabilities are an identity group that have civil rights, I think, is enormous. And I think the respect also that comes from that, it can't be underestimated. Just the why, now we're used to seeing ramps, we're used to seeing closed captioning on TV, we're used to the wheelchair lifts. And as many people point out, those benefit not just people with disabilities, but they benefit everybody from the curb cuts. I mean, can you imagine back in the day saying, like, we're going to say that every single corner in every single town, in every single city, in every single state in the United States has to have curb cuts. You imagine people saying, like, that's impossible. How could you do that? It's a fact of life now. And it has the double use, skateboarders, people with strollers, people with wheelchairs, and so on. All of them have those abilities. People in bars that are noisy can watch the closed captioning. I mean, that idea is very, very important. Yeah. Also, I'm part of the baby boomer generation. 56% of people over 65 have disabilities. So the reality is that these benefits will ultimately benefit a majority of the population if everybody has a chance to live long enough.
Finally, Lennard, one of the things that in the last few minutes of our conversation, one of the things that jumped out at me that I was kind of shocked by was what you said, that the ADA, as it was written back then and in the late 80s and eventually signed into law in 1990, would not pass Congress today. Why?
Well, I interviewed over 50 people for this book, Enabling Acts, and including, major politicians. And every single one of them I asked, left or right, said that the ADA would never pass today.
Wow.
I mean, it would be seen, it would be seen as big government, unfunded mandates, a lawyer's paradise. I think that's the case. And we have the actual example that there is, the ADA, one of the things that was important is that it became the template for all of the disability laws around the world. And the UN fashioned a treaty on disabilities that included much of what was in the ADA, signed by every country in the world virtually, and ratified by every country except the United States. The United States has not ratified it. And under this Congress, and just last year and this year, they tried to get it through and they could not do it because it was seen as UN telling us how to run our country.
And yet the ADA helped form the basis for this international treaty, the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So the US paved the way, was a trailblazer in 1990. And then refused to ratify the international convention based on the ADA. I mean, that's crazy.
It is crazy, and it is a reality. I mean, Bob Dole, who now is in his 90s, came out of Walter Reed Hospital to go to the floor of the Senate and beg his colleagues, who many of whom knew him very well, to vote for the treaty, and they refused. So it just shows you that bipartisanship, kind of a fantasy, will never be a reality now under the present conditions.
Finally, also, Lennard, where does the ADA go from here? I'm sure, can use improvement, as any law can. Are there moves by the coalitions that are now probably stronger than they were before to improve the ADA, to make sure that it remains the law of the land, but also get strengthened? You mentioned, for example, people with disabilities remain the most poverty-stricken group in the nation. That is a shocking statistic, and is there work being done to fix that?
Well, I'll say there are a number of things that are going on, including executive orders from President Obama. There is one bill which is actually, so the thing is, like, as the Republicans, I think I'll make that a party issue, want to shrink government and see programs and what they call entitlements as a negative. The fear is that they'll cut back on the programs and the funding that's there. So there's definitely a movement to try to prevent that, possibly. And the other thing is that, well, I'll give you a specific bill. It's kind of outrageous, but because of a 1938 act, there's something called sheltered workshops, and they permit people with disabilities to work for as little as 22 cents an hour. And Goodwill Industry, for example, has those sheltered workshops. They pay some of their workers 22 cents an hour, while their regional managers get more than $500,000 a year. So, so I think about that actually before you go to Goodwill. But the point is that the sheltered workshop concept has to end. People with disabilities have to get minimum wage. That's just not negotiable.
Well, Lennard, I want to thank you so much for joining us today and having this conversation with us. Best of luck to you with your book.
Okay, thank you very much, and I really appreciate the opportunity.
Lennard Davis is the author of Enabling Acts, the hidden story of how the Americans with Disabilities Act gave the largest U.S. minority its rights. This is Uprising. Anna Buss is our assistant producer and technical director. Christian Beck is our production coordinator. Teddy Robinson and Jonathan Alexander are our audio engineers. Annie Mendoza is our social media coordinator. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/Uprising with Sonali. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com. Our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Gohatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. I'll see you next time.